Okay, so this is the chapter 7 presentation. My name is Malcolm.
I'm Alicia.
I'm David.
And I'm Nick.
And so we're going to get started. We're discussing the business ethics. So at first, we're going to look at a kind of the public opinion and where that kind of stems from. So it's kind of obvious that the public has never really had a high positive opinion on business ethics and how they perceive top executives. Most people believe that CEOs, CFOs of big corporations, businesses like that are pretty close to being, might as well be crooks in today's day and age. And one of the reasons that kind of starts stemming from that is the media mainly focuses on the negative of businesses, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just if a business is doing something good, the media won't report on it. If a business does something bad or something highly unethical, the media will report on it. So it's kind of you're being ethical, good, you're supposed to. You're not being ethical, well, now we're gonna make light of those situations. So there can definitely be a sway because of that. And a big reason they focus on that is because it also has an incentive for the media because they get more viewership based off of ethical scandals. People tune in to watch Fox, CNN, or any type of news to see kind of what's going on and more of the drama involved. It's not very dramatic to talk about how a business is following the law every day. So that does play a role. And also societal changes. In general, we're a more educated society. So therefore we have received higher expectations because of that. We believe businesses should be set at a higher ethical standard because we're now in more of a knowledge based about what they do and how they operate. So then I'm going to go transition over to some of the big major ethical scandals that have occurred that kind of lead to why businesses have such a negative perception. So Enron is a very common one to bring up. People talk about it, or at least bring it up in big frauds and scandals, but details never are brought into. They were an energy company who saw pretty great growth from the 80s. They became Enron after a couple companies merged. And so the beginnings of their scandalous activities and unethical ones was with fraudulent trading. There were 2 Enron employees that found a tactic in the market because one of Enron's how they operated was trading energy, and they found a fraudulent way to make Enron a lot of money. And Kenneth Lay, the owner, was made light of this, and instead of stopping it, he actually promoted it. And this led to Enron making a lot of money on paper. And there were then investigations with the SEC regarding securities fraud with those 2 employees, and one of them was actually convicted. And during that, Kenneth Lay, who was promoting it, said he had no idea what was going on. So that was the beginnings of that. And actually, after one of the fraudulent traders was put in prison, Kenneth was now seeking another way to make money. And that's when he brought in Jeffrey Skilling. And he is pretty notorious for a lot of things that he did. But one of the major things that he went through was mark-to-market accounting. He got this approved by the SEC, where he could take any deals that they made. Let's say they had a deal, they could value it at $20 million and put it on their books. And they didn't really have anybody going against that. In addition to that, he also promoted something called like a natural selection work culture. He was a big risk taker type person, and he believed in Darwinism and survival of the fittest. And so every so often they would review employees and just fire them because of poor performance. He would take the bottom employees and just get rid of them. And this kind of promoted even down to the lowest employees to have unethical work habits. The other part to the mark-to-market accounting that leads on to what happened with Andrew Fastow is even if the deals fell through, like the earlier example of a $20 million deal, if that fell through and stopped occurring, they would still leave that on their books, which kind of leads to Andrew Fastow, who was their CFO. And Kenneth Lay, Jeffrey, and Andrew were the big three that were involved with all these scandals and promoting them. Andrew would take those deals, leave them on the books, or shift them around on the books, along with creating shell companies to move Enron's large debt. Because during their operations, especially overseas operations, they incurred quite a bit of long-term debt, and they wanted to look more profitable and liquid, so they would move those to these paper shell companies that never existed. And Andrew actually made one shell company and got people to invest in it, and then they would skim money off of that as well. And this all leads to, since they were a public company, they had to be audited by an outside firm. And that firm was Arthur Andersen, which was part of the big five accounting firms, one of the biggest firms ever. And pretty much Arthur Andersen was taking kickbacks to lie on their auditor reports regarding the financial accuracy of the financial statements that people like Andrew Fastow were signing off on. And they were the reason that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in 2002. So that's already one big scandal. Investors lost millions of dollars. The punishment on these gentlemen wasn't very high. Jeffrey Skilling actually recently got out of jail like a year ago and is now in the business world again. So we can kind of see where people don't have a good perception on business ethics or how the government handles certain aspects like this. And then another ethical scandal was Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme. In his earlier years, he was a securities trader. He started a securities trading firm in early 1960s, and he gained a strong reputation very quickly. He was like a market master. He was pretty much one of the main creators of Wall Street that made Wall Street kind of give its name today. And he was always providing incredibly consistent returns. And that brought up a lot of questions from people in the actual field, which leads to me discussing his actual practices. A competing firm tried to reverse engineer his trading methods and found out that practically the only way he could get as consistent of his returns that he was getting was to either be having insider trading, which is fraud, or he was running a Ponzi scheme, which is what he was doing, where if you don't know what a Ponzi scheme is, he takes money from one person, uses it a little bit to pay off another investor, and then he skims money off the top. He had billions of dollars wrapped up in actually one Chase Bank account, which kind of leads to other allegations of Chase Bank seeing this very large bank account with a lot of money that most people would never leave in just one bank account, and brings up the ethical practices of Chase Bank itself, because did they know, or were they truly oblivious to what he was doing? Because the problem is he never actually invested any of the money. He hadn't made an actual trade since 1993, which leads to the downfall. The only way he actually got caught was in 2008. The SEC was brought about 5 different times, potential information about him running a Ponzi scheme, but it never stuck. But then when 2008 happened, investors wanted to pull money out, and he couldn't give them their money because he didn't have it, because he was skimming the money off and taking it. And then he couldn't, because of the recession, he couldn't get more people to invest in him. Therefore, he had no more money to pay them off. The scheme was unveiled, and he got about 150 years in prison for the rest of his life. So that's one of the examples where the government did crack down on a lot of the fraud, because he's in his late 70s, early 80s. So he's spending the rest of his life in prison. The last major ethical scandal that is actually still going through with the trial is Theranos. They were thought of to be going through a medical breakthrough for ideas. Blood testing machines were inefficient, and people had to give a lot of blood, and they were making claims of getting one prick from your finger could run hundreds of tests through a machine. This would revolutionize the medical field. Elizabeth Holmes, the CEO and the main person committing all the fraud, she went to Stanford, dropped out, and then what happened was she was a very persuasive person and had very strong ties to political figures. She was endorsed by people like Obama and tons of senators. She pretty much tricked America because everything that she claimed about her data and her tests were all lies. Their prototype could barely run a few tests that they had, and it ran them very poorly, very poor accuracy. They would use third-party equipment to run the tests, and so they were still pulling about the same amount of blood, and then claim that their prototype was doing that. She cost investors about $9 billion, and she is currently waiting trial for her crimes, but her charges aren't very high. She can face up to 20 years in jail, but some people's lives were destroyed. And so that leads to why the public has a very terrible perception of business ethics, because people can generally, we're not saying she's necessarily getting away with it, because 20 years of your life in jail is definitely serving some time, but some people's lives were completely ruined because of this. So then transitioning on, I'll let Alicia take over in defining ethics.
So ethics, when you talk about ethics, I think it's important to differentiate ethics and morals. Ethics are standards of conduct from an external group or source, like the society or business, and then morals are more of the standards of conduct within yourself, an individual. Next slide. So there's business ethics, and that is the rightness, wrongness, fairness, or justice of actions and practices within a business context or workplace. And then there's descriptive ethics, and those, they describe and characterize and study the morality of people. And these focus on the learning of what is occurring and like the realm of behavior and actions within a business or industry. And then there's the normative ethics, and they seek to uncover and develop or justify the basic moral principles that are intended to guide the behavior. So these are more of like normal, like what you would think is normal thinking within just everyone. And then next slide. Conventional approach to business ethics. So this approach is to compare a decision, practice, or policy that is being used with prevailing norms or acceptability in society. So with this, you want to ask two questions. Whose ethical norms do we use, and what ethical norms are prevailing? So are we going to use our family, friends, religious beliefs, local community? Basically, you're going to go through whose norms you could use, what you've learned throughout your life, and then whose norms would be more appropriate for making the decision that you're trying to make. And then next slide. So the sources of ethical norms, these are all the sources that it shows that you can, that you may be getting your ideas from. It be fellow workers, family, friends, the law, your religious beliefs, where you're from, regions of country, like profession, employer, and of course, sometimes the norms from one source are going to differ from another. So you have to consider that. And Next slide. And then there's 3 elements involved with making an ethical judgment. First, we observe or participate in the decision, action, or practice that is taking place in a workplace setting. And then